Thank you.
We're talking today on the annual report on the Freedom Net, and you have there some very pessimistic news. Basically, for the fourth consecutive year, freedom of the internet is on decline. What does it mean, and how do you measure it?
That's right. So this year, for the fourth year in a row, as you mentioned, globally we've seen declines in internet freedom. Specifically, of the 65 countries that our report covers, 36 of those saw declines in internet freedom over the past year. The most dramatic declines were in Russia, Turkey, and Ukraine. And then, similar to our findings in past years, the countries that really performed the worst out of the survey, again, are Iran, Syria, and China. So, and then more broadly speaking, we have identified a couple of new trends this year in terms of internet freedom developments worldwide. One of those trends is that we're seeing in democratic countries and more authoritarian regimes, governments are implementing new laws that specifically target the internet as a field for regulation. So some of these laws cover, regulations on online content, or increasing the government's ability to conduct surveillance on information and communication technologies or other regulations of this kind. In addition to new laws, we're also really seeing an increase in countries that are arresting internet users specifically for their activities online. Particularly in the Middle East and North Africa, of the 11 countries that we study, 10 of those countries arrested internet users over the past year. So arrests are definitely on the rise. And then finally, we've noticed that there is a trend of increased pressure against independent news outlets specifically. So in a lot of countries, we're seeing, especially where the traditional sort of broadcast or print media environment is very restricted or controlled by the government. And in those environments, for the past few years, the online sphere has really been the only area where there's been independent or critical voices. And now we're really seeing governments starting to crack down on those online independent voices in very worrying ways.
Let's focus for a minute on those three countries that experienced the most significant decline. We're talking about Russia, Turkey, and Ukraine. What happened there specifically?
So in Ukraine, for example, we saw negative developments primarily focused around the Euromaidan protests starting in November and then through February and March of this year. We saw particularly a significant increase in violence against online journalists and bloggers who were covering the protests. In total, there were over 150 journalists, including online journalists, who were physically assaulted, beaten, or shot at during these protests, or in some cases kidnapped. And that really had a strong impact on the internet freedom environment in that country. We also saw an increase in things like cyber attacks during this time against websites, and increased evidence of government surveillance on activists and journalists in the country leading up to this point. And then kind of similarly in Russia, we've actually seen kind of steady declines in internet freedom, particularly since mid-2012. But these declines really escalated this year in response to the unfolding events in Ukraine. We saw Russia really start to target some of those online independent media outlets in a way that they had not done previously. That happened in March. They used a new law that was actually passed in December. This new law allows the prosecutor general to issue orders to block online content related to extremism or calls for unsanctioned public protests. And so this law was then used quite quickly to block independent media outlets within Russia that were either reporting on the events in Ukraine or that had been critical of the Kremlin in the past. In addition to that, we've seen Russia really step up their controls in a number of areas that we've seen in the past. So, for example, there's been increased evidence of surveillance of internet users. We've seen an increase in this paid government trolling, so people online who are manipulating online content to make it seem like everyone is in favor of the government's policies, particularly in Ukraine. And we've also seen, again, like I mentioned, kind of increased economic pressure against independent media outlets within Russia.
Laura, is it something that is unexpected? Because frankly, internet until now was kind of exception because it's such a large sphere of human activity that was basically uncontrolled. So can we say that the governments are just catching up basically to this phenomenon because they couldn't, let it go ungoverned, uncontrolled for a long time?
In a way, I think we are seeing a trend similar to this. In some cases, our report, for example, measures a variety of different aspects of internet freedom. So we look at limits on content, for example. We look at violations of user rights, and we also look at access to the internet. And globally, we have seen more or less this trend of as more people are online, as access increases, you also see sort of a crackdown in subsequent years from the government in cases where that increased access is deemed problematic by the government that is in power. So on the one hand, access might be increasing. That's a good thing for internet freedom broadly. But then on the other hand, it depends on the quality of that access, what that access means for citizens within a given country.
So these worrying trends, is there any reason to expect that they might be reversed, or say the internet in a couple of years will be very different from the one that we got to know and love?
I would say globally, it's good to look at the bigger picture. In cases, I mentioned there are some countries that consistently perform poorly year to year, and in many cases, there's not a lot of expectation that those countries will improve. This year, we have seen significant pushback from civil society, which we've noticed in past years, but it really was kind of accelerated again by the NSA surveillance revelations that have been occurring over the past year. There's been kind of a wave of reactions to that, some negative, some positive, but one of the examples that we've seen kind of throughout the world is internet users really starting to take it upon themselves to learn how to be more secure in their online communications and being more aware of what it means when they're conducting activities online, whether it's just communicating or kind of the pages that they're visiting, which really is important, particularly for countries that are more repressive and where the government will crack down on internet users. So for example, if the government has access to someone's data, that could have really negative ramifications for that person. We've seen people be thrown in jail for private communications on social media and things like that that you wouldn't necessarily see in other more democratic countries. So that kind of broader global awareness and also increasing pushback from civil society is kind of where we're seeing some room for improvement, some potential positive trends in the future.
So let me be a bit of a devil's advocate, because when you take a regular netizen, average person that is a bit scared of the internet and what can be done today, for example, in a sphere of financial transactions, or even now the Supreme Court of the US is grappling with this case of intimidation of a estranged husband to his wife. He was posting violent messages on the Facebook, and they don't really know whether he should be convicted for it or they should overturn it. So is there some limit to how free the internet should be? I mean, is there any good in these limitations?
We're seeing, like you said, there is a changing conversation around a number of kind of fundamental human rights and how they interact potentially differently in the online sphere. So things like the right to privacy, the right to freedom of expression, all of these rights are intertwined and need to be protected, and that the protections that are needed might be different in the online sphere than they are offline. So what we're looking for and what we are starting to see in a few countries are new laws being proposed or kind of actions on the part of the government to really secure internet users' rights online. So on the one hand, internet freedom kind of stems from governments not restricting content, not arresting users for legitimate speech. On the other hand, you also need some protections for internet users. So things like protecting the right to access and principles like net neutrality and things like that, but also taking into account individuals' privacy and how privacy is important for freedom of expression, which really is something that came about, in reaction to these NSA revelations.
And how do you interpret the localization of data, the so-called balkanization of the internet when each country is trying to secure its own servers, etc.?
We have seen an increase in these proposals for data localization from a range of countries. We saw in Brazil there was a proposal to include some data localization requirements within the Marco Civil legislation that was passed in April. Luckily, that was removed from the final bill, so the bill went forward with largely positive protections for things like privacy and net neutrality again. On the other hand, you have countries like Russia who are starting to enact these data localization policies, stating things like we need to protect our citizens' data from, either from surveillance from foreign governments or from cyber attacks and hackers and theft and things like that. On the other hand, in countries like Russia, this really means that if you're requiring companies to host Russian citizens' data on Russian soil, that really makes it easier for the Russian government to access that data, and that can potentially be very problematic for Russian internet users.
So the US government says that it is a big champion of net neutrality, of net freedom, etc. But then, again, you've mentioned the NSA scandal, the surveillance programs being revealed. And of course, the argument is that it is needed to protect the country from terrorist threat. Is it justified? I mean, how much damage did it really cause to the reputation of the US as a champion of internet freedom?
I think the NSA revelations really sparked a broader conversation, an important conversation, and it's one that we're still, within the United States, are still grappling with in terms of how to potentially rein in some of these practices, but also, like you said, kind of the balances between security and other rights, right to privacy, right to freedom of expression. So in that case, the United States report has actually declined over the past few years largely due to the revelations about surveillance. On the other hand, our report really looks broadly at internet freedom as a whole. So while the US has been a lot of the focus of these surveillance revelations, and rightly so, there are a lot of other aspects to internet freedom that can kind of be forgotten about when you're focusing on one issue. So the US is actually quite strong in a lot of areas in terms of not blocking any content, in terms of internet access, although perhaps not as strong as some Western European countries. But in terms of broader internet freedom, the US is still a leader in the field, and also a host to a lot of companies that are very strong actors in this field. So it's something that will be definitely an issue that comes up over the next few years, for sure.
We've mentioned a couple of countries. Is there actually an ideal model that some country is, applying somewhere in the world that can place it on top of, the internet freedom?
There's not one ideal model because, as we know, every country is different and is dealing with the different circumstances. At the top of our report, and again, we cover 65 countries out of the world, we see Iceland and Estonia as consistently the top two countries who are performing the best. And Estonia particularly has done a lot to really establish themselves as a leader in internet freedom over the past decade or two. But again, comparing Estonia to Iran or Estonia to China, every country is different, or even Estonia to the US, just the size and composition of the countries are going to be quite different. So there isn't one model, but we are looking to those countries that are performing more positively on the survey in terms of kind of some best practices. So Estonia is a positive example. This year in Brazil, we saw the passage of the Marco Civil legislation, like I mentioned, which has been kind of hailed as a framework for the internet, or kind of a bill of rights for the internet. And actually Brazil the report overall showed improvements this year, and they went from the partly free to the free category. So we have seen some improvements in that, and that's one area where we can look for some models in terms of internet freedom.